All right, welcome back for our very last session. I'm Darcy. This is Amanda. We're back in the traditional lands of the Tsawwassen First Nation, and we are talking about the final part of Deepak Malhotra's The Peacemaker's Code, Part 6, The Historian. And we're only kind of talking about it because this is also, we don't want to wrap the whole book up because we have a discussion in September. So don't expect us to answer questions. We're just going to ask them.
Yeah, our real goal today is to just kind of be like, here's some of the themes we hope to chat further. The book ties a bunch of stuff up and it leaves a few things open, which, the seeds are there for a sequel.
Yeah.
Right? So that part's exciting, right? Like we're finished here and yet. And so, themes?
Well, okay, except that you have to let me say that the sequel I'm envisioning is a poetry book. And I can't let it sit. I'm just curious to see where poetry goes. But yes, themes. Honestly, there's a lot. We've had kind of a conversation throughout these videos about, first we talked about it as a time thing and then memory stuff, and I'm really curious about that, and the way that over the arc of all 6 parts, the way time and time management and the way memory and time interact. I'm actually very interested in having some conversation about those pieces and elements and what they mean for a solution that is talking about how lasting is this, how long do we have to do stuff and think about it.
And what do we do with that time?
Yeah.
Right. I think that piece is really interesting. I think in this chapter we see some kind of making peace with the injury that has occurred, and like what does that look like, and that like how do we heal when we return from something back to our family, and how does that happen when we are changed by an incident, and how do we find our like new place in the world when the world feels different.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And another thing that we did talk about before we got into this is that both of us kind of wanted a little more more of a chance to know what was happening on those calls and those negotiations that we didn't get to read. So we want to know how all of you feel about those conversations that we didn't actually get to read, the negotiations that were happening kind of behind the scenes between the US president and China and Korea, and I think we had some conversations happening with Russia, with Canada, with Iran. There were kind of a bunch of different countries that we know were having calls secretly back and forth with one another in conversation with each other. I know there's definitely some conversations that the US president wasn't privy to, and I'm curious what those negotiations sounded like and what hints of it we actually get to see, because we don't get to see the actual negotiation. We see some negotiations play out, but we don't get that cross-border stuff, and we get some hints in the very final end part in the historian that there is some like opening and openness to having further negotiation and discussion. I'm curious where that goes.
Yeah, absolutely. This seeing of like peace being made between traditional enemies because there is a bigger problem, right? And how will that work, and what might that look like? And I mean, we've seen that in other places in history, right? Where traditional enemies have made peace. I mean, my brother and I, we move somewhere new, we make peace right? Because the new people are scared what those pieces look like. And so that is, I think, really interesting. And we see this theme of like how the other is evil. We're not evil. Our behavior is okay, right? This baiting somebody else into a fight to look like the good person stuff, right? The classic stuff in family conflicts, right? Classic stuff in family conflicts, right? I mean, classic even in sports, right? It's the retaliation that gets the penalty. It's all of these spaces, and so I think that is a really rich discussion. There's that lovely scene with like Kilmer telling all of the different right people in the room about how they're not actually the good guys in this sort of request to look at the other side with nuance.
Yeah.
Right? Look at the other side with nuance, not just to assume evil. right? To assume evil is to be a problem in this discussion about like how can we negotiate with people who are very different than us or whose actions look evil.
Yeah.
And what does that mean in order to invite them into negotiation? And so that piece is I think going to be quite interesting. They talk a little bit about relationship. I'm actually quite relieved at how the romantic relationship that I was so nervous about in the beginning has played out as like a key driver. It feels very soap operatic at many points, right? These kind of classic tropes that you see in soap opera, like amnesia, right?
Yeah.
Like just like all of that playing out. But it's a driver of many of the pieces without being kind of the central story in some ways.
Yeah, I found it very helpful. I think we talked about some of our skepticism. I appreciate that at no point were we asked to believe that the value of human life was just this one hot girl, which I, was a little, that's something that we've seen before in other pieces of fiction. So I was pleased. I think there's some interesting discussion to be had about the value of creating a romantic attachment like that to build on, especially with, we've talked about kind of the memory stuff, the memory and identity stuff, how feelings can trigger memories. I think there's something to kind of explore there.
And there's some hints about like the values of friendship and how friendship can also be one of those things that reaches across.
Yeah.
Right? The arc that Archidamus goes through, that like hero traitor kind of arc, and the similar arc that like Kilmer's reputation amongst the aliens seems to go through. I mean, they mirror one another a little bit, and that really interesting, like how do we view the other and like elements of the other, right? And how are these kind of complicated characters viewed as we look back at them and as we look forward, and how does that change depending on like where we are in our own history, right? And you see this, we look back at history and we rewrite the stories, and our characterizations of what people did change.
Yeah, and I want to tag onto that because one of the conversations we had weeks ago now, maybe in the first part, we talked about the assumptions, and we were kind of being played with a little around gender and titles and jobs. And I think there's something to be said again for the way that has stayed a consistent piece. Now we're here at the very end of the book, and there's these similar things. What does historian mean? Why is historian and professor, those are like, do they have different connotations, but how are they being used? What does traitor mean? Different things for different people. I think it's an interesting place where we have been given 6 parts of this book, all leading to tell you that the connotations of certain words might not be the only way to read them.
No, and that play around assumptions. So there is the assumption that Kilmer makes about the fate of Archidamus, which is right, and you see him make it, and we kind of make it with him. Yeah, right? Absolutely. And then we get and so that's an assumption about what happens in this society when somebody is a traitor, because it's what happens in our society, kind of, right? So there's that piece that's an interesting play on this, and then right near the very end, that comes up again in that lovely scene where the president is inviting somebody to a task force, and Kilmer assumes it's him. Yeah. Right? And so that space of these assumptions keep playing out. And so I'm super curious, both kind of how you saw yourselves making assumptions through the book, how you saw the characters making assumptions through the book, and that, because that's been a running theme through the whole piece. And probably we make different assumptions as we read it because we are different readers. Yeah. Right? And so our interactions with the text will be different. And so I'm just very curious where that comes up for you.
So on the 13th, we will all get together, and you can bring your notes, I'll bring my notes, and we can kind of talk about what we haven't talked about, what have we missed. Throughout this book, you've been hoping we would say something, and we haven't. So come tell us what we should have said, or tell us where we're wrong, tell us where we're right. Tell us where we said something smart that we came up with all on our own, maybe.
And there's key themes that we probably missed. Yeah. That when you were reading them, they were really front and center. Just different readers find different things, and so whatever those pieces are for you, I would love to hear about them, because that always makes it more interesting. So hopefully you'll come chat with us on Twitter or on Zoom
or both. we're open to conversation. So see you then. Bye.